Ice hockey fans had quite the wait for a simulation experience on Nintendo 64. Sure, you could argue that Wayne Gretzky hockey was a great arcade experience, but those looking for something with more depth and realism to get stuck into had to wait until the release of NHL Breakaway 98 on the console to get their first taste of next generation realism. Coming from Iguana West in Utah, the same studio behind WWF Warzone, Acclaim's entry into the ice hockey arena was met with generally positive reviews, at least for its N64 release. As a multi-platform title, there are naturally differences between the console versions, but I personally liked both the PlayStation and N64 releases. Focusing on the Nintendo 64 version for this review, the game features the NHLPA license, up-to-date rosters and teams, stat tracking, and despite what the box may tell you, this is a medium resolution game. Simulation fans will be pleased to see that there's the ability to sign free agents and trade players, scouting reports and coaching available. But of course it's all about the gameplay, and I personally feel that NHL Breakaway 98 did a great job as a first entry into the series. I must say that the PlayStation version did come out before this, but it's not a straight port. The Nintendo 64 version features improved graphics, a reduction in the default game speed, and tweaks to the cameras. Graphically, the game is nice looking for the time when it was released. Like almost all sports titles, the game hasn't aged that well when compared to modern releases, but I remember thinking at the time this game came out that it looked more like a high quality EA Sports title in its visual department. The players have different builds and heights, and that may sound like a strange observation, but it's amazing how many sports games still had no differences at the time. The game's menus do look very 16-bit however. They're way too rough around the edges, and it gives a stark contrast to the decent in-game visuals. Now this won't annoy everyone, but for those who spend a lot of time in the menus doing things like setting up plays, then you will start to yearn for more clarity. What's most notable though about the gameplay, however, is the momentum-based checking system, which essentially gives you more power the faster you're checking at. This gives the game quite a realistic feel when playing. If you try to check somebody from a standing position, you'll have little power, but try again when you're at full speed and you can send opponents crashing. Adding to this, players can lose sticks and helmets, and there's a decent amount of moves, tricks and animations for things like goal celebrations. Further to this, the game's music is nice enough, and the sound effects don't do, well, too much really. They do sound a little bit compressed, so don't expect any CD quality audio like the PlayStation original. Commentary is limited to general arena announcements such as calling team names and player numbers. It's just about enough to be passable, and again, given the constraints of the cart format, it was perhaps a bit too much to ask for player names to be called out or to have play-by-play commentary. Perhaps for me though, the biggest disappointment in the game was the passing mechanics, which are quite poor. You do have the option of on-the-fly icon passing for accuracy, but the overall controls feel far too slow and unresponsive. I lost track of how many times I tried to pass to an open player, only to then be checked into oblivion by the opposition because it hadn't responded. On a side note, the AI in the game is actually fairly decent, and there aren't any guaranteed goal sweep spots that I could personally find when playing. As I mentioned previously, the game received positive reviews for the N64 release, and naturally a follow-up was put into the works, and this is where things get somewhat interesting. NHL Breakaway 99 features updated teams and rosters, including the addition of the Nashville Predators, but everything else from the front end view is pretty much the same. You have the same options, the same stat tracking, the ability to create players and so on. And it's frustrating because the sequel has done nothing to address the problems the first game had for the most part. The puck physics are a little too floaty still, and whilst I note that the passing seems a lot more responsive than 98, it's still not as fine-tuned as it needs to be to make this a must-own title for hockey heads. In an interesting bit of trivia, this was the first sports title that year from Acclaim's sports series that didn't feature a high-res mode. When all of their other sports titles used the expansion pack to give a higher resolution option, it was strange to see this as the only game in their series that only have a standard medium resolution mode. I know many gamers aren't too bothered because, as we know, the expansion pack often had improved visuals at the expense of frame rate, but the frame rate here is still not as fluid as I'd have liked, and so I'd have happily taken an improvement in the graphics department because there's very little visually to make you realise you're playing the sequel here. Eagle-eyed players will notice that the ice textures have been improved, with this release, but there's really nothing like player reflection seen in EA's offering, and the players still move a little too stiff without the motion capture realism offered by other sports titles. I did notice that the audio seems to have been improved, not in terms of the quality, but this time there seems to be more effects, organ music, announcements and checking noises. There's also still no play-by-play, which again other acclaimed sports titles were offering, and so overall it's hard to say that NHL Breakaway 99 is nothing more than a tweaked upgrade rather than a greatly improved experience. Simply put, neither game is great, but it does have its moments. I personally feel that the AI is a strong enough point in both games to make this a fun game for those who take their sports games seriously. It's just a shame that Iguana seemed to call in the sequel rather than taking their competition from EA more seriously. Naturally, this led to the sequel getting lower scores than 98, despite 99 actually being the better of the two games. Both titles are cheap and easy enough to find, and if you can get 99 for your collection then pick that one up, but if you can only get hold of 98 then you're not really missing much. For fans of the sport, however, I will say that I personally find the arcade-like Wayne Gretzky series much more fun to play, and it's a better title to own because the multiplayer options make it much more open to casual fans and those that wouldn't typically play an ice hockey game. Despite my old man being Canadian, I wouldn't say that I'm a huge hockey fan. I watch my local team, the Sheffield Steelers, from time to time, but I'd love to hear from any big hockey fans as to what you think the best N64 hockey game was. Personally for me, I don't think anything could ever surpass NHL 95 on the Mega Drive, but there are certainly some other games worth checking out, and so let me know of any other hockey games on any other systems that I or anyone else watching would enjoy, and as always, thanks for watching, and until next time.